Good morning, M&Ms. Misty here to bring you some updates on all of the cases that we are following. Mercedes is stuck at work, unfortunately. As the holidays are impending, work is getting very, very busy, and everybody wants to go home and spend some time with their family. But I wanted to make sure that everyone was brought up to date on the most recent developments in Luigi Mangione. So last week, there was a big surprise. He waived extradition in Pennsylvania. This we knew was going to happen. There had already been an indication from his defense team that he was going to be transferred to New York and face those New York state charges. And those state charges are significant. They were amplified and elevated from second-degree murder to second-degree murder and first-degree murder in furtherance of terrorism. And so that charge is very, very significant and carries a life without parole sentence in the state court. Carries a life without parole sentence under the New York state law. Well, we all expected him to come to a state court. We all expected him to enter the court and plead not guilty in response to the indictment on the state court charges. But all of that changed. And at the very last minute, a federal complaint was filed. So this isn't at the stage of indictment. It's a federal complaint. And the federal complaint also charges Luigi Mangione with murder, with the use of a firearm, as well as stalking and other gun-related and gun possession charges. Now, that is a very different case from the New York case. The federal case requires the U.S. attorney, the prosecutor, to prove that Luigi Mangione stalked Brian Thompson and crossed interstate lines to commit murder. So he began his journey in Atlanta, came to New York, shot Brian Thompson. These are all the allegations in the federal complaint, and then left and went to Pennsylvania, all the while using what would constitute interstate commerce, which means his cell phone, the internet, as well as crossing those state lines. So it's a very different case from what needs to be proven. The federal level, that interstate line crossing and coming to New York from another state, all of that matters. And the prosecutors will have to prove that he intended to commit murder. Now, the state level charges for the top charge, that first-degree murder with the aggravated factor of in furtherance of terrorism, that is very different because prosecutors will actually have to prove motive, which is not the norm in the courtroom. They have to prove intent, but not usually motive. So in this particular case, under New York state law, they'll have to prove that there was some broader purpose, and the statute defines terrorism as trying to intimidate a civilian population through violence or trying to influence a government policy through coercion or intimidation, or in this case, through murder. Now, both cases are going to have the same pool of evidence. Both cases are going to be working with the manifesto, the gun, the bullets, the monopoly money, the backpack, the fake IDs, the video surveillance footage, which captures the suspect, who is Luigi Mangione, every step of the way, linking him forensically to that path and to actually committing the murder of Brian Thompson. So all of that's going to be the same, but it's two different jurisdictions. So it's state court and federal court. So there's a different prosecutor for each one. There's a different judge for each one. And each one really is independent when it comes down to the trial of the case, meaning evidentiary decisions could differ. It could be some evidence is admitted in the state law case that's not admitted in the federal case. All of it is a bit early to opine on right now, but that is certainly going to be something to watch out for. Another issue to watch out for, which case is going to go first. So as of now, the U.S. attorney who oversees that jurisdiction said that it's likely the state level case will go first. It was filed first, and that case is a bit procedurally further along because a grand jury convened and indicted Luigi Mangione, whereas in federal court, there's a federal court complaint. So The state court case is on its way now because Luigi Mangione appeared yesterday before a state court judge and pled not guilty. It was a very, very short procedural appearance. Nothing else really happened during that appearance, but behind the scenes, we know that those defense attorneys are working to make a plan of action to attack both the federal level charges and the state level charges. So we're likely to see some of that in the coming weeks, especially with respect to evidentiary issues, motions to suppress, and also to try and get some of that very, 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 very smoking gun evidence out of the courtroom. Whether or not they'll be successful is difficult to tell. Other questions: what's the defense going to be? Well, that's largely going to be shaped by what evidence actually is going to be admissible. Not everything we see in the public sphere actually gets admitted into court. And so there's a couple of different avenues that the defense could go. At this point, it does not seem like it would be credible by any means to say that it wasn't me defense. And I say that because there's just too much linking Luigi Mangione to the case to make that argument from a defense perspective. So there are other arguments that he could raise regarding his mental state. Now, insanity is a really hard road to hoe because you have to not be aware that what you're doing is wrong and not understand the nature and consequences of your actions. So something so meticulously planned, and also when somebody tries to cover their face and get away, really undercuts that. But there's another defense called mental disease or defect, which is not an affirmative defense, meaning it doesn't mean not guilty. It just means maybe there's a possibility of a sentence based on a lesser crime, basically saying that something, by some reason of mental illness, the defendant could not formulate the requisite intent required under the law, meaning the intent to commit murder. So it's going to be a tough case for the defense no matter what, but we'll see how it shapes as those evidentiary issues are hashed out. And that's really going to be the difference between how the defense proceeds. And once that is all underway, we'll see what happens. Also, it's important to note that it's the defendant themselves that makes all of the decisions. So the lawyers meet with the client, speak to the client, talk to the client about what they want to do, talk to the client about what it means to take a certain course of action. Here's the consequences of going down this road. Here's the consequences of going down that road. Our recommendation is that you do X. Ultimately, the client has to agree and say, that is the path that I want to pursue. So here, it'll be interesting to see what happens because the manifesto is incredibly problematic to both cases from a defense perspective. The federal government in the federal case doesn't have to prove why he did it, but the manifesto really speaks to intent, and it also includes a planning document which speaks about the plans that were put into action in order to commit this crime. So when you're talking about selecting a target and going from point A to point B and having at least a portion of that memorialized in the manifesto, that's going to be a problem from the federal court case where that's literally what needs to be proven. Now, the state court case, again, has a lot of it has an additional burden on prosecutors to prove that motive and to prove that it falls within the defined statutory definition of terrorism in New York. But that same manifesto, and especially what we saw in the federal court complaint, and this kind of illustrates the overlap between the two, it speaks to the why Luigi Mangione allegedly took these actions. It speaks to the mindset. It talks about not being happy that he delayed his plans or procrastinated because he could learn more about the company, meaning the company itself wasn't necessarily the entity or the individual that he wanted to target, that there was a broader purpose and reason for doing so, which is also written in the manifesto that, oh, this company is perfect. It's the message speaks for itself. Insurance during this bean counter investor conference, and then I'm going to whack a CEO. So all of it's not really that specific to the individual or the insurance company, and some of what we had opined about before that, okay, maybe, he's this guy who experienced these back problems and had an issue with the insurance industry or the healthcare industry. And so he specifically targeted this particular insurance company. It turns out he wasn't insured by that company. And based on what we're reading in the manifesto, the argument is going to be that it really didn't need to be Brian Thompson. It didn't need to be United Healthcare. It just needed to be a company and a CEO that was symbolic of this broader message. And that's where the argument fits into what would qualify for first-degree murder in New York. So we actually learned a lot from the federal complaint that will be very, very relevant to the state case. So all of that being said, this case, even though it seems like we talk about it every day and there's so much information out there that's all very true, but the case itself is actually in the infancy of a litigation, meaning it's at the very, very beginning. Luigi Mangione pled not guilty. That was just yesterday. And so the next step is there's going to be a scheduling conference. There's going to be basically a timeline for when the next evidentiary exchanges and conferences and all of that will actually take place. So this one is on the road on the state court case. We know that on the federal court case, there's another upcoming conference at the end of January where we'll get a bit more clarity on how these cases are going to play out, which one's going to go first. Elephant in the room, elephant in the room. So right now, the U.S. attorney is saying that it looks like the state court case is going to be proceeding first. And by the way, from the perspective of leverage from a prosecutor, to the extent that there's a world where Luigi Mangione may plead guilty to life without parole at this point, it's probably not a situation like we opined before where maybe there would be a possibility of parole. Probably not now, given the federal charges. But from that perspective of just what it means for the defendant and for the defense team, there's always that possibility that that could happen. And that's because there's going to be a looming federal trial in the background. So if the state law case goes first, there's a looming federal trial in the background. The burden that needs to be fulfilled in order to prove that, again, a very different, much cleaner case than the state case, where you have the first-degree murder charges, which are unique and rare in New York. And not only that, that the issue of whether or not it falls under the umbrella of terrorism. And based on what we see in the manifesto, there's certainly an argument there. What if the defense attorneys are successful in getting excerpts of that manifesto out? Well, the case changes dramatically. So we'll have to see how that shapes up and plays out. Right now, it looks pretty bad for the defense. And so you have this looming federal court case there in the background where now there's the possibility of the death penalty, which we don't know yet if the DOJ is going to pursue that. But it really changes the analysis of how to approach each one from a defense perspective. So that federal court case, and this is what it's saying, the elephant in the room, so something else to watch out for. Right now, it seems like the state court case is going to go ahead, and maybe there'll be a pause on the federal court case, but that could change. There's a huge change to the Department of Justice coming in in less than a month at this point. It's December 23rd. So on January 20th, Donald Trump will be inaugurated, and there's going to be major changes to the leadership in all federal agencies, DOJ to be included. It's going to be a new attorney general. Ultimately, the attorney general decides about the death penalty. It is that individual who makes the final call after, of course, it's reviewed internally, a memorandum is prepared as far as recommendation, and then ultimately it lies in the attorney general's hands. So that's one thing to be aware of, is that these policies that the Department of Justice is utilizing right now could dramatically change in that time period. Also, I'm not sure that it's a secret to say that Donald Trump and Alvin Bragg, not best friends, a lot of headbutting there. So is there a world where the Department of Justice says, no, actually, we want to take our case first? We're so close to the threshold of when those changes are made, and both cases are so early in the life of a case that really anything could happen on that front. And so there might be a little bit of a tug of war, push-pull behind the scenes as to which case is going to have priority and which case is going to go first. One thing we know, Pennsylvania case, who knows when we're going to hear about that again? It doesn't go away, but that is absolutely on pause pending the outcome of the New York and federal court cases. So all of that is what to keep an eye out for. As far as the spectacle that occurred when Luigi Mangione was brought from the Wall Street heliport to the federal courthouse. There's a lot of backlash about that now, and presumably the mayor and because he was front and center in that entourage. And also there was a lot of security. The anti-terrorism unit was there. So it's a lot of optics. That's very unusual going to federal court. Usually it's unmarked black cars going up going down the highway that would be pretty nondescript and pretty low key. And that's what we saw today, this transfer from federal court to the state, from the federal penitentiary in Brooklyn to the state courthouse. Not a lot of fanfare regarding his entrance into the courthouse, and not a lot of optics as far as what that looked like. It was just the very, very usual transfer from one spot to another. But that whole thing received a lot of backlash because, and again, you don't know who's saying this stuff on social media. It could be a small percentage of people, but social media erupted with a lot of response to Luigi Mangione, and positive response. There was an SNL skit on Saturday night where during that weekend update component of the show, his name was merely mentioned and the audience went nuts and started cheering. So I bring this up because from a legal perspective, first of all, it's something for both sides to take into account. Prosecutors are going to want to make sure that there's not a stealth juror that sneaks onto the jury in both jurisdictions. And that's a person who wants to influence the outcome of the case one way or another. Because they want to get on the jury, and they may hide information about themselves in order to get on the jury so that they can have an impact on the outcome of the case. All of those people will be, the goal will be to get them eliminated. The other is the issue of giving the defendant a fair trial, because sometimes this large media attention can be difficult because people already have made a determination about how they feel about the case. And that's a problem from a defense perspective too, because no matter who you are, you're innocent until proven guilty, no matter what an individual is accused of. So what are some of the strategies that will be used here? And depending on which venue you're in, federal or state court, but each one has a certain amount of for cause challenges to jurors. So individuals that can be removed for cause. And then there's individuals that can be removed for other reasons that both sides, they're called preemptory challenges, either side doesn't really have to say why, but there's a limited amount of them that they can use. So for cause is one thing, and everybody kind of has to agree that there's a reason to keep this individual off the jury. Then there's preemptory challenges, which are a bit different, but neither side needs to say. They can actually remove someone for any reason or no reason at all, except for what are called protected class statuses. So not because somebody is a man, a woman, a certain religion, a certain race, whatever. So that's all that component. But so there is a limit on who can actually be eliminated from the jury. And so there's probably going to be a situation where there will be a broad question at the beginning, similar to what we've seen in other high profile trials. Who is biased here? And it's almost like normally the judge would dig into that question, but in this case, they might not. If you say you're biased, might be like, okay, go, because we need to weed through so many individuals and we can't really waste preemptory challenges or otherwise for cause dismissals on individuals who've already told you that they cannot make up their minds. So it's going to be interesting the way it plays out. I suspect you're going to see jury consultants really being a huge part of this case. And part of that will be for every individual in that jury pool to go through and look at that social media presence and see what an individual may have said, tweeted, liked, retweeted, whatever it might be. And that can help to uncover who might be a stealth juror or who might be somebody who says that they can be unbiased, but really may have already formulated their opinion about the case. And some of what we might see might be less than what would be normally getting an individual dismissed from a jury pool. So if you've got individuals who are saying, oh, look at his new haircut, did he get his eyebrows waxed? There was a lot of chatter about Mangione's appearance and I'm not talking about his appearance in court, like the nuts and bolts of it, his physical appearance after he was transferred from the Wall Street helipad to the federal court. And so if you have somebody kind of glamorizing that would be an individual that maybe that wouldn't have been enough in another case. But in this particular case, that could be enough for prosecutors to say, I don't know about this person. We may want to just remove them from the jury pool. So it's sure to be very interesting. A lot could happen in the interim. A couple of things that need to happen if the defense were to say that there would be an insanity plea that has to be entered prior to trial. So there's a time frame on when to make that determination. It's obviously not for a bit of time because the defense has to make that decision about whether or not to pursue it after receiving all of the evidence that gets turned over by the prosecutors. So a lot could happen. That's one option. Again, I think that's unlikely to succeed. It doesn't mean it isn't raised. It doesn't mean the defense preserves their right to actually raise it. So jury consultants are going to be very central to this case in order to weed out individuals who may be coming in with biases or may even want to be on the jury and may not share the entirety of their true opinions or how they feel about this case or the healthcare industry or insurance industry. One thing that will be true is that there'll be people on the jury who are going to have criticisms of the healthcare industry and the insurance industry for sure. That's not going to be enough to get kicked off a jury in general, but there certainly will be a bit of a probe and a deep dive into how far that goes. And each juror will be asked, can you put your personal opinions aside and make a determination based on the courtroom, the evidence, and what you hear during the trial? So it's going to be a challenge to seat a jury that is coming in unbiased. It's going to be a challenge for both sides, but that voir dire process will help weed out those potential jurors. And boy, is that going to be a very, very, very stringent process in both venues, both the federal court case and the state court case. Again, we don't really know how the defense is going to shape up. We probably won't know for a bit of time because the lawyers are likely to be speaking to the client and figuring out a path forward. But certainly there's going to be a lot of activity on this case moving forward, and we will keep you posted on everything. In the meantime, happy holidays. Have the most wonderful holiday, whatever you celebrate. Have a great time and make sure to loop back up with us next week when we return. Happy holidays, M&Ms.